Hi there and welcome back to the Drawing Database. It's Professor Marc Layin, and today we spend 15 minutes with the drawings of Jacques-Louis David, French painter, neoclassical French painter, born in 1748, I believe, in Paris, and died in 1825, I think, somewhere in Belgium. So we see in David a figure that was certainly neoclassical in that movement, influenced by Greek and Roman antiquity, both in symmetry and content. And we see an artist who was a court painter of Napoleon, as well as a figure who worked in the time of neoclassicism, but also Romanticism was beginning and burgeoning, as well as they were almost butted up to Impressionism, not quite, but certainly close to that. So our first drawing, we see a lovely chalk drawing, heightened in white and heightened in some color. We see some stumping going on in the blending of the charcoal or the chalk tone. So he adds a graphic layer of marks, cross-contouring and hatching marks, as well as allowing some of them to soften and blend. He integrates nicely the background tonality of the image, as well as, again, the cross-contouring to emphasize the movement of the body forms around the figure, through the figure, and of course the lovely head structure that we see from David here. A thorough understanding of the structural components of drawing with the eye line, nose line, the bottom of the lip line, obviously the center line, and so forth, to accomplish a great degree of flexibility in his drawing practice. And we actually have quite a bit of existing drawings left over from David to show us his graphic work, which were mostly preparatory drawings for his paintings. Here we see a drawing in preparatory, very finished drawing for the coronation with eagles of Napoleon. Here in a classic sort of one-point perspective that we see, very rigid, almost harkens back to a little bit of Leonardo, if you will, into a classic one-point perspective where we have the horizon line about here. And you can follow these angles to find where that vanishing point is. It might be just here or almost slightly right outside the composition, but it's roughly right in through here, and it looks to be all one point. So when you're analyzing drawings or paintings or works of art that use perspective, if you're not sure, number one, find the horizon line. Number two, look at some angles and follow those angles to their natural conclusion, either on the picture plane or off, and you'll find your vanishing points, either 1 point, 2 point, or 3 point. But this seems to be very classic. 1 point with true verticals that are vertical, so we know it's either 1 or 2 point, and we see this particular line up with the horizon line, so we know that our orthogonal lines or our converging lines go to just one vanishing point. Otherwise, we see a drawing in black chalk. We see a drawing heightened in white chalk. We see a scene with as probably many figures as you could ever want into a composition. So flow of the piece comes in through here if you follow it abstractly. Let's take the rest of those marks off and we'll follow composition now to see what David, how he was designing the piece. And so we see the flow of the composition up through here, and notice how we get some straights here, and then we come back through the focal point and down through and up and over. So the true focal point is right here. He places the lightest lights relatively against most of the darkest darks in the composition. Now there are other lights here, but notice that there's not enough dark around it. There are lights here, which you think could be a little bit intense and fight the focal point. It might do a little bit, does a little bit, but because he places Napoleon at the highest point above the horizon line, minus the angelic metaphoric, allegorical, if you will, figure. He becomes still the focal point, and then lastly, the angelic figure is surrounded by enough of the same value here that doesn't disturb what is truly the focal point and the reason for the image, which is Napoleon. So very political piece, which David, some argue that he was a propagandist. I don't necessarily believe that. I think he was trying to make art, make a living, and certainly he did very well, but he also was, again, the highest court painter, if you will, or the state painter of Napoleon's desires and also his commissions. Here we see a linear Layin in the style of French, the French Academy. If you go back and you think about the artist Ingres, we see the same kind of contouring style with respect to the image, so heavily linear, mostly all linear, throned on a seat here with some, looks like some snake, perhaps snake's heads here, obviously. And then a graphic style, probably done in chalk or maybe even graphite, which would have been close to have been processed at that time, probably so. And so we see a lovely sensitive graphite or black chalk drawing on a little bit of textured paper we see over and through here, and enough control of the pencil to give us some line weight variety, especially in the head, and just a little bit of tonality up into the head. And then lastly, if you don't understand the gridding is not aiding in the drawing or the drafting of the figure. The grid here is to help scale up the drawing size. The drawing was done from most likely observation, to scale it up to a much, much larger size, to begin to scale it to a size that would be the same proportion as the square grids. So let's just say if this was 1 inch by 1 inch, right? Then you could scale this up to maybe, oh gosh, let's say really big. Let's say 8 inches by 8 inches. Now these become, on the new image, 8 by 8, and then he can draw using the squares of the grids the same figure and get it much 8 times larger. Here we see a lovely chalk drawing, heightened slightly in white, right here on a toned paper, a little bit of a manila or beige yellowy warm tone. And we have the image of the political poet and revolutionary Marat, the death of Marat, who David painted after committing suicide, as his rebellious nature indicated that he soon would be attacked by the state and they would come for him and imprison him, or worse, execute him. So he decided to end his own life in a bathtub that David rendered in oil in his career very successfully. So here we see a lovely drawing with a clear, definitive passion for expression, obviously. Now as we get to the technical applications, we see the lovely head structure, the head tilted over slightly, being bent this way and over. We see a division of light, half light, right, and also half dark, which is really indicative of excellent kind of thorough illumination of a three-dimensional form. We see the light source from the left, so the shadows are to the right. And we see the core shadow really roughly in the middle, those darkest areas of the core shadow here and along here, and then the soft and some reflected light in the cast shadows. The cast shadow on the eye and a little bit of form coming through there. The glazed sort of eye to signify death. And a wonderful control of hard edges, more cast shadow, a crisper edge in through here, and then the integrity of the boundary edge all signify a wonderful control by David of the forms and three-dimensionality of light, and also the technique of this interspersed hatching and cross-hatching technique to develop a tone overall. So I'm assuming this is either in chalk or it's all in graphite, probably not silver point because he gets some pretty rich darks in through there, but it does hearken to, again, a neoclassical idea, very controlled, cool temperament, as well, with some expression of, obviously, of death, and then of course good control in the structural qualities of the drawing. Here we see multiple figures in the composition, studies for some particular kind of drama. It harkens back in the United States of the revolutionary time of dress, so we're certainly in roughly the age of Enlightenment, maybe slightly after that in the late 1700s, maybe early 1800s, but it feels very, very set in the 1700s, and we see various scenes of perhaps political persuasion, argumentation. We see pleading, and we see consoling, perhaps, down in through here. So certainly some drama that's going on in the control of the linear quality of the drawing. Perhaps these were done in washes, so they were done in chalk and/or washes are all in ink pen. Let's go in a little bit deeper to take a more conclusive look here at some of these. I find these particularly fascinating. The control of the line, the relative looseness for David is wonderful to see, even though they're still very concrete, and then the tonality of finding those shadow shapes as we see here, and then laying those in a simple wash over, and then also these cast shadows work particularly well for an exercise of multiple figures in multiple studies, and they make a really lovely, lively page of figurative representations that he probably had people pose in. Here we now have a lovely study here. It harkens to me a little bit of Tintoretto, with still in the French academic style. So we see the figure with notations here. I don't read French, so I can't quite understand what that says, but we have the back in through here, the biggest design line, the extremity lines in through here, axes for the hip and also the shoulder, and then the obviously the head symbol, and then we're into town defining the figure. He really almost over-defines the muscles of the scapular region, the lower back, the sacrospinalis muscles, and notice how the glutes are very much a butterfly, and then he starts to define the biceps femoris muscles, semitendinous and membranous, gastrocnemius, soleus, and on down to the Achilles. This is a great study to see how an artist probably out of his own imagination drew this figure in practicing either anatomy or perhaps a study for an idea for a drawing and or painting of some importance later on in his artistic endeavors. Here we have an image what looks to be a drawing, preparatory drawing for the Oath of the Horatii, probably the most seminal work of his and probably the most important work, you could argue, for neoclassicism, with a very balanced composition of three soldiers taking an oath to fealty to their king or their ruler, who would be over off this page to the right. And you notice how balanced these figures are as they raise their hands in fealty and loyalty. You have the threes that would make also a triangle, so there's a neoclassical idea of 1, 2, and 3 equal sides. The drawing itself is very neoclassical, very French academic atelier studio for that time, very contoured and controlled, very slow and methodical and meticulous, and then a laying in of the shadow patterns and the shadow shapes. So here in the white robe we get a sense of how the finish could go. So he studies the drapery to a more sophisticated finishing, heightening it with white chalk and probably using a stump of some sort for both the darks and also the lights. It's very soft, very elegant, very accurate, and very illuminated and controlled. But I think also important for the student of drawing, or anybody, for professionals and for aspiring students, is to look at the preparatory under part of the drawing, and we see the lay-in of the legs in through here and the anatomy, and the really great control of all of the drawing techniques, especially his lay-in of the shadow shapes. Notice how simply they're conceived in terms of the use of value or light and dark. They're not fussed over, they're not completed, but they give a sense of a light side and then a dark side to give the artist and also the viewer the understanding that it's illuminated, it's simple, it's easy to read, and if the artist needs and wants to develop the drawing further into a finished study like we see in the robe, notice we don't see that in so much in the other figures. We get the block-in style, especially in the head, in the arms, and over to the legs and feet and down, so forth. We see how he arrives at his block-in and how excellently communicated it is. And then if and when the artist wants to take the preparatory study further, he can take it, he or she certainly can take it to this conclusion, which is very illusionistic, well controlled in tone, value, form, and the illusion of dimensionality. So I think this is a really important drawing to take note of. And lastly, we can end today on a watercolor by David. We don't see those as often. But what's nice about these, again, are that they exist. They exist from David, and we see a lovely scene of a fisher-type boat here, lonely vessel, if you will, in a what perhaps could be a more feudal time or a more ancient time, monarchical time, with sort of a castle looking out through here, tower of sorts, and perhaps a bridge or an aqueduct with maybe two figures out here. I see that as well. Simplified value structure. Let's analyze where the light's coming from. Perhaps over to the right, and then down and through we see the cast shadow from the boat over through here. So once the delicate line is laid in, perhaps in pencil or ink, the washing starts. We generally work in watercolor from light to dark. So the lighter tones that you see would be laid down first and generally would be allowed to dry, and then the middle tone values that are controlled over and through here would be next. Notice how he controls lovely the edges of the forms, both cast shadows, right? The harsher cast shadows, or the harder edged integrity boundaries here, but also the softer modulations within the shadow tones. And then lastly, the darkest shadows would show up afterwards and be the final layers of the composition, although also the value structure. And then you could also work a little bit wet into wet to make soft transitions like he does here as well. So there is the work by David, a incredible draftsman, neoclassical artist that was connected heavily and really cannot be separated, in my opinion, from the time of Napoleon and also his influence.